Mekk-Knights are one of the most surprising archetypes to ever be printed, not because they're confusing as can be as to what are Mekk-Knights. They're psychic creatures, but like they look like machines, and then Morningstar came out. Clearly I'm not cultured on the lore, but the point still stands that competitively, Mekk-Knights surprisingly had a larger impact than most thought they would, and today we're gonna discuss why were the Mekk-Knight cards tier 1. First, I should give a little synopsis as to what the Mekk-Knights actually do. They are a column-based archetype that essentially are free special summons and give immense card advantage and pressure. A perfect example of this can be seen in the invoked Mekk-Knight deck, where your goal is to OTK and go second and win as fast as possible. And to do that, you not only have great resourcing with the invoked cards, you also have great resourcing with the Mekk-Knights. The Mekk-Knights are large bodies that essentially give you more and more free cards. Purple Nightfall is a wind-up rabbit for the archetype, being able to exile itself from the field in order to search you any Mekk-Knight. That's already better than wind-up rabbit. It's basically a 2018 version of what wind-up rabbit would look like. Then we have Mekk-Knight Blue Sky, which can special summon itself. And this means that you can add Mekk-Knight monsters based on the amount of cards your opponent controls in the same column as Blue Sky. If 2 or more cards are in the same column, you can special summon Indigo to that column, and then Indigo can move itself in order to summon another Mekk-Knight from your hand. This is where the meme Move Man comes from. Then you have red and yellow, which can either destroy a face-up monster or a spell and trap in the same column as that respective Mekk-Knight. So essentially, if there are 2 or more cards in the same column, you can special summon these guys, and then they get a ton of amazing value. Clearly, they don't really provide too much disruption, but over time they've gotten better. But in general, these are very powerful, very potent, very resourceful, and consistent cards to add to any deck. You don't necessarily want to add these to every deck because, as we'll get into, specific archetypes have really been able to utilize these effectively, but depending on what you're looking for, Mekk-Knights can solve a big problem, and that is just applying pressure and more card advantage. Over time as well, we've gotten new Mekk-Knights. For example, we've gotten builds like Pure Mekk-Knight, where you're able to abuse all the World Legacy cards at their fullest potential because everything's a Mekk-Knight. You also have Mekk-Knight Orcus Gearsuit, which is an Orcus card, but it's also a Mekk-Knight card, so you have the ability to synergize the Mekk-Knights with the Orcus. Now, realistically, when the Mekk-Knights were tier 1, you would never actually be able to use Mekk-Knights and Orcus in the same deck because Gearsuit came out a little too late, but Gearsuit still combines the archetypes to this day, so if Harpor ever comes back, you never know, you may see Mekk-Knight Orcus become a thing. There are also other builds we need to discuss, like Invoked Mekk-Knight and Trickstar Skystriker Mekk-Knight. Generally speaking, they don't actually do that much. The Mekk-Knights are a very weird engine, and this is why I said they're surprising. When they first came out, no one really expected much from them, but randomly, we were in one of the most toxic formats ever, the Pendulum True Draco Format 2 Electric Boogaloo, and in this scenario, Invoked Mekk-Knight was a tier 1 deck, just because the Mekk-Knights gave a big enough boost to Invoked for it to be relevant. Before I get ahead of myself, let me get to the point here. The Mekk-Knights should not have worked. The problem with Mekk-Knights is that they don't actually provide disruption, and in today's game, it's all about board breaking and board establishing. And the Mekk-Knights are great at board breaking because they just randomly do so much, but at the same time, they don't do enough to set up a board. Additionally, their most inherent flaw is the fact that you have to have 2 cards in the same column to special summon a Mekk-Knight, making them wildly inconsistent going first, but going second, they are absolute powerhouses. And so at first glance, you think that this archetype shouldn't work just because it can't go first. But in the lens of building a go second deck, these cards are absolutely perfect, and somehow they're so good, even though they're not as good going first, they found a home in a few going first decks because the format was such in a specific position. Generally, I think the Mekk-Knights are one of the most interesting archetypes ever printed, and they're the first archetype to truly abuse the column mechanic, more so than any other archetype in the game up to that point, unless you want to include Magical Muskets. But the problem is they were never meta. But instead, the Mekk-Knights were meta, and right now, let's figure out the Mekk-Knight Mekk-Knight's history. But before we continue, I'm gonna plug my METAFY to oblivion because I want to make sure you guys get the help you deserve. METAFY is a service that allows you to get coaching from the people kicking your butts online. Whether that be Super Smash Bros, Call of Duty, or now Yu-Gi-Oh, this is a great opportunity for people to get coached by some of the best in the game. With that in mind, you can get coached by me. I'm not one to typically flex my accomplishments, but I'm most certainly a qualified player to help you get better at the game. And if you want me to help you get better, check out my METAFY page in the description below. With that, let's continue. So next, let's talk about the 2 tier 1 decks from 2018, because I think when you click on this video, you're like, Mekk-Knights were tier 1, and while they weren't purely tier 1, as in a pure variant wasn't tier 1, the engine itself was tier 1, and this could be comprised of at least 3 Purple Nightfall, 2 Blue Sky, and 1 Indigo Eclipse. But as we're gonna see, there were also builds later on in the future that had a smaller engine of 2 Purple Nightfall, 1 to 2 Blue Sky, and 1 to 2 Indigo Eclipse, and these engines were probably when the Mekk-Knights may have been at their peak. I don't know, there's like an argument for both sides, but let's start off with Invoked Mekk-Knight. Like I said earlier, Pendulum True Draco 2 Electric Boogaloo was a format that existed for a few months and arguably is one of the most degenerate formats ever because every deck just did something stupid. Now there will be other times later on that it's a similar philosophy, 2020, but the point being, 2018 was not a good year for Yu-Gi-Oh in terms of how disgusting the decks were. And what was surprising was the Mekk-Knights somehow shined in a go second deck. I mean, considering how insane all the decks were at going first, you had Pendulum being able to set up these insane boards. You had True Draco, which set up a ton of floodgates and could go second. You had That Grass Looks Greener decks still alive and well. I mean, it's just crazy how good those decks were. But the point being, Invoked Mekk-Knight was just so synergistic with one another that it started taking a hold of some meta positions in Top Cut. We'd see this deck shine with the power of the Alistair engine being able to utilize Mekk-Knight better than any other deck, and because that deck could main deck a ton of hand traps, it meant that you were able to go second effectively and quite well. So in the end, this deck was somehow tier 1, arguably the second or third best deck of that format. And this was all fine and great, and we still see Invoked Mekk-Knight to this day. The deck hasn't really been touched all that much other than like terraforming to 1. Moving forward, the deck just kind of got power crept. The future decks just became a lot better than what Invoked Mekk-Knight could handle. And while we have gotten better go second tools, the Invoked Mekk-Knight cards have lasted since 2017 and 2018, and it's kind of hard when we're getting cards in 2021 that are just better. But then let's move a few months forward to the release of Sky Striker. This engine polarizingly changed the game forever, not only producing one of the most powerful engines of all time, but one of the most powerful decks of all time. Although we wouldn't see how powerful Sky Striker would be until Hayate came out a few months later, in the meantime we had Goki using Sky Striker and Trickstar using Sky Striker as a potent engine. And eventually, because Trickstar Sky Striker was so popular, people would start main decking Mekk-Knights. The power of the Mekk-Knights was that you had a very consistent and resourceful engine in a very consistent and resourceful deck, and because your creatures were just bigger than your opponents, you were able to beat down a lot easier, making it very hard to deal with. Not to mention the fact that Purple Nightfall dodged so many different effects so easily. Trickstar Sky Striker Mekk-Knight was a force to be reckoned with, and while going back, I don't think this was the correct deck depending on what you expected, because we also had Goki at the time and the Mekk-Knights were not that great in the Goki matchup. I still think this was a very good deck, and I definitely think that it goes to show just why the Mekk-Knights are so powerful. They are so resourceful, they are super consistent, and they do a lot more than they should all in one package. The biggest flaw has always been their consistency, but even regardless of that, Mekk-Knights somehow are still playable to this day. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. Again, make sure to check out my METAFY. Thank you all so much for watching, and with that, I hope to see you soon. Oh, and subscribe, smile.